Get away from my gate, now!
I only asked for water.
I don't care. And you handed it to him, in front of my house. He was hungry. You've never known your place in this house, Audrey. 10 years and you still don't.
At least now you've found someone at your level. This isn't your conversation.
No, but it is mine. You want to feed strangers? Then leave with this one. You're not serious. She's yours now. Take her.
Helena said it like she was discarding trash, then slammed the door on her own stepdaughter in the pouring rain, leaving her on the sidewalk beside a man she believed was homeless. That man was Nolan Reeves, founder and CEO of Reeves Infrastructure Group, a company worth several $1 billion, and he had watched every second of what Helena just did. The woman Helena spent 10 years treating like a burden, the woman she had just thrown away like luggage, was the only person in that house who had ever looked at a stranger and seen a human being. Helena thought she was finally free of a problem. She had no idea she had just handed Audrey the only door that had ever truly opened for her. If you've ever felt invisible in a place you called home, stay with this story. And if this is your first time here, hit subscribe. Every week we bring you stories about the moment everything changes. This is one of those stories. The house on Weston Drive had never felt smaller than it did the morning after Audrey's father was buried. Not because of the flowers that filled every corner, or the quiet that settled in after the last guest left, but because Helena Granger stood in the kitchen the following day and began rearranging the cabinet shelves as if she had always owned them. She didn't ask, she didn't explain, she simply moved things, and Audrey stood in the doorway, watching a version of her home disappear in real time. That was 5 years ago. Audrey had been 24, then still holding on to the belief that things would settle, that grief would soften the edges between them, that she and Helena might eventually find some livable rhythm. Instead, what settled was something far more permanent, a quiet, structural arrangement in which Audrey's role in the house became entirely functional. She cooked. She managed the household accounts when Helena's spending made them complicated. She drove Paige to appointments when Helena was busy with her social engagements, and she sat with her father during the last months of his illness in a way that neither Helena nor Paige ever quite managed. She did all of this without being asked, because she understood instinctively that asking for acknowledgement would only invite the reminder that she should be grateful simply to still be there. Paige, Helena's daughter from a previous marriage, had grown into someone who wore cruelty with the ease of a well-fitted coat. She was not unintelligent. If anything, she was sharp enough to know exactly which observations would land and which moments were best to let pass. What she had never developed was any interest in applying that sharpness toward anything other than maintaining her own position in Helena's esteem. Audrey had long since stopped expecting anything different. What still surprised her occasionally was how openly Paige could smile while doing damage, as if causing someone pain was simply a demonstration of how little that person mattered. Helena herself was not a woman who considered herself cruel. She considered herself realistic. She had worked hard to build a life with a particular shape, a certain address, a certain social circle, a certain standard of presentation, and she protected that shape with the focused energy of someone who had learned early that appearances were the only currency that never depreciated. In her mind, Audrey's presence in the house had always been a small but persistent threat to that shape. Not because Audrey did anything wrong exactly, but because Audrey had a way of looking at people that made Helena feel observed in a manner she found deeply uncomfortable. What Helena could not take from Audrey, though there is little evidence she ever seriously tried, was the particular quality that had defined Audrey since childhood. She noticed people. Not in the careful, strategic way Helena noticed people cataloging their usefulness or their status, but in the simple and radical sense of seeing them clearly. The elderly woman who delivered their dry cleaning had a name, and Audrey knew it. The young man who repaired their furnace one February had a daughter who'd just started kindergarten, and Audrey had asked about her the following spring. These were not performances. They were just the way Audrey moved through the world, attentive to the people that most others had trained themselves not to see. Nolan Reeves had, by any reasonable measure, spent the better part of 2 decades building something remarkable. Reeves' infrastructure group had grown from a regional construction firm into one of the most respected development companies in the country, known particularly for its work in community revitalization, rebuilding neighborhoods that had been neglected long enough that most investors had stopped looking at them at all. He was 41 years old, and he had the particular kind of tiredness that comes not from overwork, but from a specific and recurring disappointment in the way people behaved once they knew who he was. It was not a complaint he voiced often. He understood it, even sympathized with it to a degree. He had been in rooms where powerful people performed versions of themselves, and he knew he was not immune to the same instinct. But there was something that still unsettled him about watching a person's entire demeanor shift the moment they learned his name. The warmth that materialized instantly, the careful calibration of opinions to match what they imagined his were. It had made him over the years into someone who found it difficult to trust the first impression anyone made of him. The week of the Cedar Vale flooding, he had driven out alone. His team had flagged the neighborhood as a potential candidate for a major revitalization grant, a cluster of aging residential blocks with serious infrastructure problems, and a community that had been sending requests for help to the city for the better part of a decade. Nolan wanted to walk it himself before they put anything on paper. He'd done this before, usually without announcement, moving through a neighborhood at the pace of someone with nowhere pressing to be watching how the streets worked in real time. What he had not anticipated was how badly the rain would turn on him. Several hours in his jacket was soaked through. The sole of his left shoe had separated from the upper, and his phone had died somewhere around the 3rd block. By the time he found himself standing at the edge of the residential grid on the east side of Cedar Vale, he looked to any reasonable outside observer exactly like a man with nowhere to go. The gate of the property, where he chose to take shelter from the worst of it, was tall and black and belonged to a house that was considerably grander than its neighbors, a wide colonial with warm light in the upper windows and a covered entrance large enough to keep a person dry. He wasn't asking to go inside. He stood near the stone pillar at the edge of the property and waited for the rain to ease, which it showed no signs of doing. Audrey had seen him from the kitchen window. She'd been washing the last of the dinner dishes, the house otherwise quiet. Helena was on a call in her study, and Paige had gone upstairs an hour ago. The man outside was standing very still, which was the thing that caught her attention. Not pacing, not looking at a phone, not doing any of the things people did when they were waiting for something. Just standing with rain running off the edges of his collar, looking at nothing in particular. She didn't think about it for long. She dried her hands, put together a plate from what was left of dinner, and filled a thermos with hot water for tea. She found a clean dish towel that was thick enough to be useful, and carried everything out to the gate without turning it into more than it was. When Nolan looked up and saw her coming, he assumed she was going to tell him to move along. It was what he expected, and he was already forming the words of an apology when she held the plate through the gap in the gate and said, without any particular ceremony, "You've been out here a while. You should eat something." He told her she didn't have to do that. She said she knew. He asked out of a habit of caution he couldn't quite suppress, even in that moment, if she wanted to know who he was or where he'd come from. Audrey looked at him with an expression that was neither suspicious nor particularly warm, just direct, and said, "You're cold and you're hungry. That's enough for me to know right now." He took the plate. She passed the thermos through next, and then the towel, and he pressed it briefly against his face and the back of his neck. They did not have a long conversation. She asked if he had somewhere to go that night, and he said he'd figure something out. She seemed to accept this at face value without pushing, and he found himself unexpectedly grateful for that, for the absence of follow-up questions, for the way she'd done something kind, and then simply let it be kind, without making it into anything larger. He was still holding the thermos when the front door of the house opened. Helena's expression, when she came down the front path, was one Audrey had seen before. Not quite anger yet, but the particular arrangement of features that preceded it. A kind of controlled alertness that meant Helena had registered something she found unacceptable. She looked at the man at the gate, took in his wet jacket and broken shoe and the plate in his hand, and then she looked at Audrey in a way that communicated quite clearly that the plate was only the surface of the problem. What exactly is this? Helena's voice was the one she used when she wanted to make something sound like a reasonable question while making it clear that no answer would be satisfactory. Audrey said he needed something to eat. Paige had appeared in the doorway by then, pulling a cardigan around herself, and her expression when she took in the scene was the amused, slightly contemptuous look she wore when she felt she was watching someone else make an embarrassing mistake. "You let a stranger stand at our gate," Helena said, "and fed him from our kitchen. Do you understand how that looks?" Audrey replied that it looked like someone was hungry, and she had food. "We cooked more than we needed," she added. "We always cook more than we need." Paige tilted her head from the doorway. "Is this going to become a regular thing, because I'd rather not come home to a shelter situation every evening?" Nolan said quietly from his side of the gate that Audrey was being kind, and they didn't have to make it complicated. Helena turned to look at him, as if she had forgotten momentarily that he was still there, and whatever she saw seemed to settle something in her. She turned back to Audrey, and the controlled alertness had become something colder and more resolved. What happened next took less than 10 minutes, though it rearranged everything. Helena went inside without another word. Audrey assumed she was ending the conversation the way she always had, with a certain kind of exit that meant the subject was closed and the consequence would come later quietly. She turned back to Nolan and said he should probably finish eating before the food got cold. Then she heard Helena on the stairs, not walking down them, dragging something down them. The sound was unmistakable, and Audrey's stomach dropped before her mind had fully processed what it meant. Helena came back through the front door, pulling Audrey's old rolling suitcase, the dark blue one, with the broken zipper tab, and she crossed the front path with the focused efficiency of someone completing a task they had decided on long ago. She'd stuffed it, not packed it, with a random selection of Audrey's clothing and a few items from her dresser. She didn't look at Audrey when she passed through the gate. She set the suitcase down at Nolan's feet, straightened up, and looked at Audrey with an expression that was not angry and not sad, and not anything that Audrey had a name for. "You want to take care of people who don't belong here?" Helena said. "Then you don't belong here either." Audrey heard herself say, "You're serious?" It came out less like a question than like a thought she hadn't meant to speak aloud. Helena's answer was quiet and final. "I have been serious for years. I'm just done pretending otherwise." Paige said something from the doorway about Audrey finally finding her level. Said it with a lightness that was worse than cruelty, the tone of someone for whom the moment cost nothing at all. Nolan said clearly, without raising his voice, that Audrey didn't belong to anyone, and that wasn't how this worked. Helena looked at his ruined jacket and broken shoe and said, "Then be a hero. Take her with you." She turned and walked back to the house, and the door closed behind them both, with a sound that was less dramatic than it should have been. Just a door. Closing. The rain had not let up. Audrey stood on the wet stone path with one suitcase, a little under $400 in her bank account, and no immediate destination. Beside her was a man she had met 40 minutes ago, and believed with no particular reason to think otherwise had even less than she did. Nolan asked if there was someone he could call for her, then remembered his phone was dead, and the question hung uselessly in the air. Audrey looked at the dark windows of the house, picked up the handle of the suitcase, and said, "I'm done." It was the first decision she had made in years that felt entirely like her own. They walked without much conversation for the first several blocks, the rain thinning to a cold mist that settled on everything it touched. Audrey pulled her suitcase over the uneven sidewalk and didn't look back, which Nolan noticed, but didn't comment on. He knew the neighborhood well enough from the hours he'd spent walking it that afternoon, before the rain had turned, before the phone had died, to know there was a guest house within reasonable distance. He led them there without explaining how he knew, and Audrey followed the way people follow someone in the dark when the alternative is standing still. The guest house was a narrow brick building wedged between a laundromat and a hardware store, the kind of place with a hand-lettered sign in the window, and a front desk staffed by a woman in her 60s who didn't ask unnecessary questions. Nolan asked to use the desk phone to arrange payment, which he did in a brief, quiet exchange that Audrey didn't fully catch. He paid for 2 rooms. Her immediate instinct was to protest, to offer to pay him back, to calculate whether her $400 could cover her share. He stopped her before she got 3 words into it. "I have enough for tonight," he said. "That's all this is." She accepted it because she was tired and wet and had nowhere else to direct the argument. Her room was small but warm. There was a radiator under the window that clicked and hissed through the night, and Audrey sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, without unpacking the suitcase, just listening to the rain and the particular quality of quiet that comes from being somewhere no one expects you to be. It was not a comfortable feeling, but it was an honest one. No one in this building was tolerating her presence. No one here was reminding her by word or expression or the specific way they moved around her that she was a complication in someone else's life. She was simply a woman in a room, and the room didn't care who she was, and that was unexpectedly and absurdly something close to relief. Down the hall, Nolan sat at the small desk by the window and did not sleep. He turned the evening over carefully, the way he turned over anything that genuinely surprised him. He could have resolved every logistical problem the night had created with a single phone call, once he found a way to charge his phone, which the front desk woman had allowed him to do using an outlet behind the counter. He could have moved Audrey somewhere proper, somewhere with room service and a lobby that didn't smell like laundry detergent. He had the means, and the question he examined honestly in the quiet of that room was why he hadn't used them. The reason was not complicated, but it mattered. Audrey was at the lowest and most exposed point she had been in years, possibly in her adult life. If he walked down the hall and told her who he was, everything that came after would be shaped by that information. Her gratitude, her decisions, her sense of what she owed him, all of it, would be colored by the weight of what he could offer versus what she currently had, which was almost nothing. He didn't want her to accept his help because he was powerful. He didn't want her to feel that the kindness she had shown him at that gate was a transaction now requiring settlement. She had given him food and a towel because he was cold, and she had said that was enough reason. He wanted to give her something for the same reason, because she needed it, and he could, and that was all it had to be. What he had seen tonight standing at that gate was something he hadn't encountered in a long time. Not performance, not calculation, just a person doing a decent thing in a completely unguarded way and then letting it be decent without asking for anything back. He came back the following morning and found her in the small breakfast room downstairs, sitting with a cup of coffee. She had composed herself in the way that people do after a difficult night, not dramatically, just the particular stillness of someone who has processed something hard and decided to keep moving. The first thing she said when he sat down across from her was that she was sorry about Helena, not about her own situation. She apologized for what Helena had said to him at the gate. Nolan said she had nothing to apologize for. Audrey said she knew, but she still wanted to say it. He accepted this and then asked what she was thinking about doing next. She told him honestly she had studied urban planning for 2 years before her father's illness pulled her back home, and in the years since she had followed quietly and without any real outlet. The work being done in community development and neighborhood revitalization. She said this carefully, the way people name things they've protected for a long time. "I know I don't have a full degree," she said. "I know I haven't done it professionally, but I understand the people part of it. The part that doesn't always show up in the projections." Nolan listened without interrupting. Then he told her there was a coordinator position opening at a development firm. He knew entry-level project support, the kind of role that was genuinely useful to the right person. He wrote an address on a paper napkin and slid it across the table. Reeves Infrastructure Group. He said she should go in and ask for the hiring coordinator and mention she'd been referred. Audrey looked at the napkin and then at him. "You know someone there?" she asked. "I know the company," he said, which was in the strictest technical sense accurate. The Reeves Infrastructure Group building was not what Audrey had been picturing from the name on the napkin. She had imagined something mid-sized professional, but approachable. What she walked into was a glass tower that rose 12 stories above the downtown block, with a lobby that had the quiet confidence of a place that had never needed to prove itself to anyone. She stood at the entrance for a moment, recalibrating, and then went inside because she had nothing left to lose by going inside. She was directed to the second floor, where a hiring coordinator named Janet took her information and told her there was a larger event happening that morning, a public announcement about the Cedar Vale Revitalization Project, and the company's CEO would be addressing partners, contractors, and local press. The hiring process would resume in the afternoon. Audrey found a seat in the back of the event hall and waited. She almost didn't register them at first. Then she heard Paige's voice, a particular pitch she had spent years learning to brace for, and she turned to find Helena and Paige standing near the entrance to the hall, being greeted by a man in a gray suit who seemed to know Helena socially. A business contact with a stake in one of the contracts being discussed. Helena had spotted Audrey at almost exactly the same moment and crossed the room with the measured pace of someone who wants to appear unhurried. "I hope you're not here thinking this is some kind of opportunity," Helena said, when she was close enough that no one else could clearly hear. Paige drifted a step behind her, offering Audrey a look of practiced sympathy that meant the opposite. Before Audrey could respond, the lights in the room shifted and a senior staff member moved to the podium and asked everyone to take their seats. The introduction was brief. A company of this scale required very little preamble. The staff member said simply that it was his honor to welcome the founder and CEO of Reeves Infrastructure Group, and spoke his name into the microphone, and the room responded with the particular quality of attention that gathers when someone significant enters a space. Nolan walked out from the side of the stage in a dark suit that fit him the way expensive things fit people who've worn them long enough to forget they're wearing them. He moved to the podium without hurry, set down a single page of notes he didn't look at, and surveyed the room with the ease of someone who had stood in front of rooms like this one many times and found them neither intimidating nor particularly interesting. Audrey's mind went very quiet. She recognized the hands first, the way he held the edge of the podium, and then the set of his shoulders, and then the whole of him resolved into clarity, and the breath left her body in a way she couldn't control. Helena had gone the color of old paper. Beside her, Paige had stopped performing entirely, the careful expressions had dropped away, and what remained was just a young woman rapidly understanding something she very much wished she didn't have to understand. Nolan spoke about Cedar Vale. He spoke about what it meant to look at a neighborhood and see the people in it rather than the square footage. Then he looked up from the page he hadn't been reading, and his gaze moved across the room until it found Audrey in the back row. "Last night," he said, "when I was walking that neighborhood, and my phone was dead, and I looked like exactly what most people in this room would have crossed the street to avoid someone offered me food and a dry towel and asked nothing in return." The room went very still. She didn't ask my name. She didn't ask what I did or where I came from. She said I was cold and hungry, and that was enough. He let that settle. And there were others present last night who showed me something different, who showed me exactly how they treat a person when they believe that person has nothing to offer them. Helena did not move. She sat with her hands in her lap, and the expression of someone who has just watched a door lock from the other side. Nolan made clear, without directing it at anyone personally, that the coordinator position being filled this cycle would go through standard evaluation like every other hire. No exceptions, no shortcuts in either direction. He was not offering Audrey a gift. He was offering her what Helena had withheld for years, a fair chance with no strings attached and no debt implied. The professional consequences for Helena's business contact became apparent over the following days as Cedar Vale's partner selection moved forward and certain proposals were found to fall short of the company's ethical standards. Helena had arrived at that event expecting to secure something. She left with considerably less than she'd come in with, and the awareness arriving slowly. And then all at once that the man she had dismissed at her own gate was the man who had just decided the outcome of every contract in that room. Audrey, meanwhile, reported to the second floor the following Monday and began the evaluation process like everyone else. She wore the best thing she owned from the suitcase with the broken zipper tab, answered every question directly and without ornamentation, and did not mention Nolan's name once. She didn't need to. She knew what she knew. And for the first time in a long time, she was somewhere that was prepared to find out. In the weeks that followed, Nolan and Audrey crossed paths in the way that people do in large buildings, when both of them are working long hours on the same project briefly, at the edges of meetings in the elevator, in the corridor outside the second-floor conference room. He didn't seek her out. She didn't seek him out. But there was a particular quality to those small encounters that both of them noticed without commenting on the way he asked once how the resident consultation sessions were going, and she described something she'd observed in Cedar Vale about the way a specific intersection worked as an informal gathering point, and he stayed in the corridor 3 minutes longer than he'd planned to listening. He had spent years in meetings with people who could deliver polished analysis. He hadn't often met someone who could describe what a neighborhood felt like from the inside and mean it. She noticed different things about him. The way he listened completely, without preparing his response while she was still talking. The fact that when she pushed back in a team meeting on a timeline that would make the community consultation process too rushed, and the room went carefully quiet, waiting to see how the CEO would respond, he said, "She's right. Adjust the schedule." No elaboration. No softening. Just a clear acknowledgement that the point was correct. She had worked in an environment for years where being right was not sufficient, where being right also required being right in the right way in front of the right people without making anyone feel diminished. This was different. It was, she thought privately, what a functional room felt like. Neither of them named what was forming between them, because neither was in a hurry, and because both had learned in different ways and from different kinds of disappointment that the thing worth having was also the thing worth taking time with. The evaluation took 3 weeks. Audrey passed it without distinction in the sense that nothing about her process was expedited. She sat through the same assessments as the other candidates, submitted the same written analysis of a sample community development brief. What was notable, though the hiring coordinator noted it only in the margins of her own records, was the specific quality of Audrey's written work. Where most candidates focused on timelines and budget efficiency, Audrey had mapped the human geography of the sample neighborhood, which blocks had the highest concentration of long-term renters, where the community gathering points were what the proposal's construction schedule would do to a family whose children walked a specific route to school. She had built her entire argument around the people the project would displace before it could help anyone, and she had done it with the precision of someone who had spent years paying attention to things that don't appear on spreadsheets. She was offered the coordinator position on a Thursday afternoon and accepted it in a single sentence. Then she took the bus back to the room she was renting in a shared house 4 miles from the office and sat at the small kitchen table and allowed herself privately and briefly to feel something she didn't quite have a poem for. Not triumph, it was too quiet for that. Something closer to the sensation of a door opening onto a room that had always been there waiting. Nolan kept his distance from her work deliberately. The Cedar Vale project moved into its active phase over the following months, and Audrey was assigned to the community liaison team, the group responsible for translating between the engineers and planners on one side and the actual residents of Cedar Vale on the other. She was good at it in a way that became evident quickly, though several colleagues spent the first weeks watching her with the attention of people trying to determine whether a new hire's competence is genuine or performed. She didn't push back against the scrutiny. She understood where it came from and found after a while that the most effective response to suspicion was to keep doing the work. It was during a series of resident consultations that she found the problem. The current development proposal divided the neighborhood's eastern blocks into a higher density commercial zone that would bring new infrastructure investment, but would do so by effectively pricing out the majority of families who had lived there for decades. The displacement projections had been buried in an appendix on page 47 of the planning document, described in the neutral language of urban forecasting, in a way that made the numbers feel abstract. To Audrey, who had spent weeks sitting in community centers listening to Cedar Vale residents talk about their blocks, the numbers were not abstract. They were the family on Meridian Street and an elderly woman named Ruth who had lived in the same apartment for 31 years, and the couple running the dry cleaning shop on the corner, whose lease would not survive the rezoning. She documented everything carefully and brought it to her direct supervisor, who brought it up the chain. The question of what to do with it was still being considered internally when Paige showed up at the building one afternoon and waited for Audrey in the lobby. They sat outside on a bench near the entrance, Audrey's choice because she preferred the openness of it. Paige had dressed carefully for this, which Audrey noticed and understood for what it was: preparation, the way someone armors up before a conversation they already know they're going to lose. "Mom wants this to go through," Paige said without preamble. "The consortium, the proposal. There's money in it for a firm she's connected to. She wants you to stay out of the internal review." Audrey asked what would happen if she didn't. Paige said Helena had offered to make room for Audrey to come back to the house, her own room, a kind of practical reset. "I know how that sounds," Paige added, watching Audrey's face. "I know things weren't good, but you'd have somewhere stable." Audrey sat with it for only a moment. What Paige was describing was not a home. It was a management strategy shelter offered in exchange for silence, which was, when she thought about it clearly, exactly what the arrangement had always been, just stated plainly now. "No," she said without heat. She stood, picked up the lanyard from the bench beside her, and went back inside. Paige sat for a long time after Audrey left. She had come prepared for resistance, even argument. She hadn't been prepared for the complete absence of temptation. In Audrey's response, no hesitation, no calculation, no flicker of the old pull toward the familiar. On the drive back to Weston Drive, she found herself thinking about something uncomfortable. Audrey had a rented room, a starter salary, and a suitcase with a broken zipper, and she had turned down the offer of stability without apparent struggle. Paige had always understood her own choices as pragmatic, simply reading the available options correctly. Sitting in her car outside the house, she found herself unable to explain why the pragmatic choice felt for the first time like the smaller life. Helena moved quickly after that. She reached out to Marcus Webb, a media consultant who had recently been removed from the short list of approved vendors for the Cedar Vale project's public outreach contract, a decision made on ethical grounds by Reeves Infrastructure Group's compliance team. Webb had his own reasons for wanting to create difficulty for the company, and Helena had information. The arrangement was efficient and required nothing to be stated directly between them. Webb was providing a service. Helena was providing material. Both of them believed they were controlling the situation. Neither anticipated that the record of their coordination would become in time the most consequential document in the room. What Webb released was not fabricated, that was the particular cruelty of it. The photographs of Nolan accompanying Audrey to the guest house on the night of the rain were real. The fact that Nolan had written the company's address on a napkin and handed it to her the following morning was real. The timeline, one night followed by a job at his firm, was presented without the context that would have made it comprehensible, and the story that assembled itself from those pieces was exactly the story Helena and Webb had calculated it would be. The internal review board convened within 48 hours. They had no choice. The perception of a conflict of interest, even unsubstantiated, required formal process. Audrey was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. Her access badge was deactivated, and she packed the few things she kept at her desk into a small bag and took the elevator down to the lobby alone. Nolan found out through his general counsel and had his phone in his hand before the call was finished. He told Audrey he was going to make a public statement, set the record straight, correct the timeline, explain the guest house, explain the napkin, explain all of it. She listened until he finished. Then she said, "If you do that, I'll never know if I actually got there on my own." He understood. He put the phone down and did not make the call. Audrey spent 4 days in her rented room before the public hearing on the Cedar Vale proposal was scheduled. The city had required an open session. Residents, stakeholders, and any parties with relevant evidence could address the review panel. She had all of her documentation. The question was whether appearing at the hearing would read as a professional contribution or a vendetta, and she knew every person in that room would be watching for the difference. Nolan came to see her the evening before. He sat in the small kitchen of the shared house and didn't ask her to reconsider, didn't offer a workaround, didn't try to make it easier. He asked one question: if he weren't part of any of this, if the job and the guest house and the napkin had never happened, what would she do about what she'd found in that planning document? She didn't need long to answer. "I'd go," she said. "Those families deserve someone to go." He nodded. That was the end of the conversation. But before he left, he stood at the door for a moment and said quietly, "I see you, Audrey. Not what you can do for a project. You." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Some things didn't require a response, only receiving. The hearing room was full. Cedar Vale residents sat in the left section, several holding hand-lettered signs. The consortium's representatives occupied a row near the front, with the resigned patience of people who believed the outcome was already settled. Helena and Paige were in the middle section. Helena in the posture of someone who has arrived to observe a process she is confident she can control, Paige sitting slightly apart from her mother, in a way that was not quite noticeable but was there. Audrey presented her analysis in 20 minutes. She did not mention Helena. She did not mention the night of the rain, the suitcase, or anything that had happened to her personally since that evening. She presented the displacement projections corrected and contextualized and laid out 3 alternative development frameworks that would achieve the same infrastructure investment without requiring the eastern residential blocks to be rezoned. She had sourced the alternatives from case studies in 4 other cities, and she cited each one directly. When she finished the review panel had a 47-page document and a set of questions for the consortium's representatives that they had clearly not been prepared to answer. Nolan appeared in his capacity as CEO after Audrey had concluded. He confirmed to the panel that every piece of analysis she had submitted had been independently verified by the company's internal team, and that her access to the project data had been fully authorized as part of her coordinator role. He also provided the panel with documentation from the compliance team, the record of Marcus Webb's removal from the vendor list, the timeline of Webb's communications with Helena, and the chain of events that had produced the story leading to Audrey's suspension. He presented this not as accusation, but as context, and he delivered it in the same measured tone he used for everything. When he looked in Helena's direction, it was after he had finished. The room had gone very quiet. He said directly, and without drama, that he didn't particularly care what anyone had thought of him standing at a gate in the rain. What he had not forgotten and would not forget was how the people in that house had treated a woman they believed had no one standing behind her. He said it once clearly and sat down. Helena could not answer that. There was nothing in her considerable repertoire of social management equipped for the moment, because the moment was not about perception or positioning. It was simply about what she had done, witnessed by a room full of people quietly drawing their own conclusions. Paige sat 2 seats from her mother and looked at Audrey across the room. She saw a woman who had walked into that space with nothing but what she'd earned and had done the necessary thing without asking anyone's permission, and had done it for people she would likely never personally benefit from helping. She thought about the night she had stood in the doorway and laughed. The memory had a different weight now, heavier and more specifically located in herself rather than in the circumstances of the evening. The consortium's proposal was rejected by the review panel 6 days later. An alternative framework built substantially on Audrey's analysis was adopted as the basis for the revised Cedar Vale plan. Audrey was reinstated with a formal finding that no conflict of interest had existed. The compliance documentation regarding Marcus Webb and Helena's involvement was referred to the city's ethics board. She came back to her desk on a Tuesday morning, set her badge against the reader, and listened to the small click of the door unlocking. She sat down, opened her laptop, and started where she'd left off. It was several weeks later that Paige found her at the coffee shop 2 blocks from the office. She waited outside, and when Audrey came out and saw her, she didn't immediately walk away, which Paige understood was not a small thing. They sat at the outdoor table. Paige said what she had come to say without decorating it. She described the night at the gate. She said she had laughed. She said that was the thing she was most ashamed of, not any of the rest of it, but that specific moment, that specific lightness she had felt while Audrey stood in the rain. Audrey listened without expression until Paige was finished. Then she said, "Don't try to become a different person overnight. Just try to be someone who couldn't laugh at that anymore. That's enough to start with." Paige nodded in the way people nod when they are accepting something they'll be working on for a long time. It was not a reconciliation exactly, more like the first honest conversation they had ever had. That by itself was more than most people got. Helena came later, much later, after the ethics board process had run its course, and the practical consequences had fully settled into her life. She and Audrey met in a neutral place, and Helena said what she said without the management and framing that had always characterized her speech. She acknowledged what Audrey had actually been in that house, not a burden, not an obligation, but the person who had quietly held everything together through years of grief and difficulty, without credit, without acknowledgement, without being seen. She said she had known this somewhere and had found it easier not to look at it directly. Audrey forgave her, not in a way that reopened the door to what had been, but in the way that allows a person to stop carrying the weight of someone else's failures as if they were her own. A few years after that, Audrey kept a small object on the corner of her desk at Reeves Infrastructure Group, where she had by then built a significant body of work, leading community development projects across 3 states. It was the key ring from the broken suitcase, the small metal loop that had held together the zipper pull Helena had jammed shut on that rainy night. It was not a trophy. It was a compass bearing the reminder of the specific moment when she had stopped asking permission to exist and simply begun. One afternoon, Nolan leaned against her doorframe and looked at it. They had been married for nearly 2 years by then, quietly in a small ceremony with no formal announcement, because neither of them had needed the room to know. "You still have that," he said. "It was everything I owned that night," she replied. In a way that mattered. He looked at her for a moment. "Do you wish it hadn't happened the way it did?" Audrey looked past him through the window toward the Cedar Vale skyline, the neighborhood that was still standing, still inhabited by the people who had always lived there. "I wish they had been kinder," she said. "But I don't wish I'd stayed." He said nothing. He didn't need to. They both understood what the distinction meant, not bitterness, not gratitude for the wound. Just the clear-eyed recognition that the door Helena had slammed had only ever led to a hallway, and the night she threw Audrey out into the rain had without meaning to set her on the road to a life that was genuinely and entirely her own. There's a line in this story that stays with me: she was cold and hungry, and that was enough. Audrey didn't help Nolan because she knew what he was worth. She helped him because he was a person standing in the rain. And that turned out to be the truest thing about her, truer than anything Helena had spent years trying to convince her of. The real twist in this story isn't that the homeless man was a billionaire. The real twist is that the woman everyone treated as disposable was the only one in that house who had been living with integrity all along. Helena had the address, the social circle, the perfectly maintained appearance. But Audrey had something no one had given her, and no one could take away the ability to see another human being clearly and respond to what was actually there. We don't always get to know when the moment that looks like our lowest point is actually the door opening. Audrey didn't know, standing in that rain with a broken suitcase. She just chose not to go back through a door that had never truly been open to her. That choice, that one quiet, rain-soaked choice, was the beginning of everything. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't subscribed yet, join us here. Every week, we tell stories about ordinary people who find out what they're made of when everything else falls away. We'll see you in the next one.